I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our guest speaker today, which is Andre Lepecki.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure and very, very emotional. So there's a lot of implications actually for curatorial imagination, particularly in the visual arts, I feel. And one of them would be to start thinking about how performance and dance and choreography bring to the curator not the question of preservation, but the question of reenactment once again. So it's not about how to preserve, which is one of the tasks of the curator, right? You have to preserve the object. But actually, no, I become a transmitter of the object, and of which will be the event, right? I'll become a kind of a choreographer. I have to instruct people how to do this best in the absence of the author. It seems to me that then the question of proximity, this kind of proximal aesthetics, this kind of affective surface that you have to take into account as a curator, creates very, very, very specific challenges for curatorial imagination, dramaturgical imagination, as well as the task of the dancer, right? Or the task of the performer. Because it seems to me that, and this is a proposition, and let's see what you think of it, that as we are increasingly dealing with the works that endure in time through the work of performers in very, very close presence to viewers, what happens is that we no longer, as curators, have to deal with the question of the permanence of the object. You know, how is it that the object remains permanent in the exhibition for either forever or for a temporary exhibition? But actually, we have to start thinking about not in terms of permanence, but in terms of persistence, right? And it seems to me that the question of persistence is becoming more and more the task of the performer. As we continue to work through this kind of idea of transmission, inevitably, we fall into the question of reenactment, right? So we start thinking about whether every time we bring an object into an event, right, we transform an object into an event, if we're going to take the event again, we have to start thinking about how is it that then we're going to reenact the event with the same affective capacities that the event had before. Now, this for a performer, right, the one who will be actualizing the event, I feel brings like really, really, really strong consequences, right? So one would be to say, how is it that we train a dancer or a performer to receive this kind of works, and to think about the possibility of its reenactment, right? So in order to replace an object, we have to reenact the event. And this is something that I feel is super, super central right now. And at the same time, what I think it does is to open up then the possibility for us to start thinking about curatorial practice as a practice of translation. And because we know that the original is never going to be there. We know there was some kind of original source. But we know that what we'll be dealing with is just going to be a transformation, an inevitable transformation of the event. And here I'm thinking about this beautiful essay, well-known essay by Walter Benjamin, The Task of the Translator, right? In which he talks about, and he has like this incredible sentence, he says, the idea of life and afterlife in works of art should be regarded with an entirely unmetaphorical objectivity, right? And I think that performance studies and performance theory has been very invested in the notion of the life of the performance, right? And it's very invested in, particularly in Peggy Phelan's work, in thinking about how the life of performance is actually marked by its disappearance, by ephemerality, right? And I think like what these kinds of works, or the situation right now, forces us to think about, it's not about the life of the work or the ephemerality of the ephemeral life of the work, but actually the afterlife of the work. And what I think like Benjamin does with this notion of afterlives that we have to take very, very seriously is to actually consider that there has never been an original. If you remember, like, kind of the argument that he's saying in the task of the translator, right, is that we have a kind of an original, but the problem of the original, let's say, is that the original cannot in itself bring into the world all of its potentialities, right? And therefore we need someone called the translator, which will bring another potentiality for that original, right? And therefore the translation is not a betrayal of the original, but actually the fulfillment of a promise that the original could not fulfill in the original language, right? So when we start thinking about these questions of transformations, usually we start thinking about the kind of betrayal of art forms, right? So dance betrays itself when it goes into the museum, or as Michael Fried would say in 1968 in his essay on art and objecthood, art degenerates as it approaches the condition of theater, right? So, wow. So we have like still this kind of purist understanding, right, of genres, right, that are dismantled precisely by the ethics of translation, right? So what happens here is that we have so what happens is the space in between, the metaphor, the transference, the transmission is the work. Is that kind of making sense? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that then, if there is an ontology of performance to be rethought according to the current conditions of presentations of work and curations of work, is precisely to think about the ethics, the economies, and the politics of this transmission. I think like all of these things, like all of these conversations, and particularly the affective turn, forces us to start thinking about artistic practice, not as creation, which has always been the kind of theological model of artistic practice that we received, like the artist as a kind of demigod, semigod, like the artist creates, right? And in a moment of neoliberal demands that we all creative people, there's nothing more horrible than to create more. But actually, composition can actually, instead of being seen as creation, composition is precisely the word that could emphasize this kind of assemblages, right? The posing together, like let's put this kind of proximity, right? Let's create proximities, let's create assemblages between proximities, and the proximal does not necessarily need to be physically next to each other. You can create proximity with very far away things and people. But maybe just to push a little bit further this idea of composition, which I really, really like, as opposed to the idea of creation and being creative.